Professor Camilla Naidu, Executive Dean, Faculty of Humanities, Professor Joost Fontein, Professor Fraser McNeill, Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Pretoria, senior leaders of the university, members of Senate, and other academics, distinguished guests and students. Sanne Manani, goeienaand, good evening to Bella. It is indeed a great honor and special privilege to welcome you to the Professorial Inaugural Lecture of Professor Joost Fontein. As I do so, I wish to express a warm welcome to his loved ones, special guests and colleagues. This is indeed a proud, joyful and a landmark moment for Professor Fontein, for us here at UJ, for higher education in South Africa and beyond. This inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into office and deliver the inaugural addresses. The ceremony has its roots in medieval university and serves multiple purposes. First, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors, although I think Professor Fontein has been a professor for quite a while now already. Secondly, it provides a platform for professors to display their expertise in the relevant discipline and showcase their research. Secondly, in the tradition subscribed to by universities, assuming the role of the professor refers to the gown and the cap. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown, denoting the professorship, will formally be assumed. Today, we gather to witness Professor Fontein's entry into the illustrious community of scholars at our university. It celebrates his contribution to the discipline and ultimately his impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, academic legitimacy, and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointment of a person as a professor. This evening, we will listen to Professor Joost Fontein as the gown goes to town. By this, I mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates through society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and ultimately the whole of society. In the past, several philosophers and scholars have defined universities using very narrow concepts. For example, the search for truth, for universal knowledge, and even as instruments serving the purpose of the economy. Through our work and research at UJ, I hope that we can break out from these narrow viewpoints and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good, working towards societal impact. What is the role then of the intellectual? Edward Said, in one of his articles, defines the role of the intellectual as someone who commands a vast knowledge of a specific discipline, who is rigorous in analysis of literature, who views being an intellectual as a vocation, and who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies. And I know you're busy with quite a few policies at this stage. It remains then for us, as a university with a Pan-African vision, to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors. This evening, we will listen to Professor Joost Fontein as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not conclude once a lecture has been given. This inaugural lecture does create an opportunity for a self-reflective pause in the journey of the professor. Let me now invite the Executive Dean, Professor Camilla Naidu, to introduce Professor Joost Fontein. I thank you. Dialboga, Nyabonga, baie dankie.
Vice-Chancellor Functionary General Counsel, Mr. Dries Pretorius, our inductee today, Prof. Joost Fontein, Respondent, Prof. Fraser McNeill, colleagues, distinguished guests, welcome to this inaugural address. Good evening, Sanne Manani. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Prof. Joost Fontein, and I'm going to offer just a synopsis of his more comprehensive and colorful CV. Professor Fontein was born in Utrecht in February 1976, 9 minutes before one of his brothers, 5 years after the other one, and 2 years after his sister. When he was about 4, he traveled with his parents and siblings to a place where they spoke mainly English, He was sent with his 9 minutes later brother to a fancy school where Joost first became aware of and increasingly concerned about the conceits and arbitrariness of distinction, hierarchy, and authority, something that has stayed with him throughout his life. Always searching for the margins wherever they appear, he found himself reading anthropology in Scotland, where he made some lifelong friends with many others, also looking for the creative possibilities that come from movement, migration, and the edges of life. With a heavy dub bass line rapidly shaping the soundtrack and temporalities of his life, he traveled far, widely, and determinedly until he found himself in Zimbabwe. There he spent many long hours over many years talking to and living with people who were deeply preoccupied with their lost pasts, lands, and sacred places. These experiences forged more lifelong friendships and helped him learn to speak yet another language, Xishona, and fed into his doctoral writing, which was published as his first book in 2006, The Silence of Great Zimbabwe. He continued learning from the people of Masvingo in southern Zimbabwe, even as he found himself teaching anthropology at Edinburgh. With restless, itchy feet, and never one to take the artificial boundaries of geography, class, race, or citizenship any more seriously than they deserved, when an opportunity came to move to East Africa in 2014, he jumped without hesitation. Soon after publishing his second monograph on Zimbabwe, Remaking Mutirikwi, and already deeply drawn into what he sometimes calls the macabre phase of his research, the writing of his third monograph, The Politics of the Dead, he found himself increasingly drawn to the sharp erudition, optimistic confidence, contradictions, and lively energy of the always emergent city of Nairobi. There he found intellectual inspiration amongst that city's creative thinkers and doers, leading to a series of exhibitions at the National Museum of Kenya, and more recently, another book, Nairobi Becoming, assembled in collaboration with many new lifelong friends and colleagues in East Africa. A month in exile in Dar es Salaam helped Joost improve his nascent Kiswahili, much needed as he continues to work on his fourth monograph, Nairobi Materialities. Never content with focusing only on the conceptual creativity of his own wordsmithery, Joost has, through the years, devoted much time and energy to the writings of others, both as an educator and as an editor, having edited the Journal of Southern African Studies, co-founded a journal called Critical African Studies, and currently as editor of the leading anthropology journal about this enormously diverse and exciting continent, Africa. But thought and creativity are not limited to language or text, and in his non-professional life, he plays with paint and with sound, running a radio show and a sound system. Impatient to see and engage with the creative possibilities of all people and places, he aspires to keep moving across and learning from the place he calls home, our one world. So with this introduction, I invite Joost to deliver his address. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, people. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming, whether you're here in person or online. In considering what I might talk about today, I thought that I could talk about some ideas that have preoccupied me for some time, to do with humanness and what I call the productive uncertainties and excessive potentialities of stuff. And I thought I could use this opportunity to apply some of these ideas. Oh, sorry. Can we stick the slide on? Aha, got it, great. And I thought I could use this opportunity to apply some of these ideas to a key problematic concern of our time and of our discipline, social anthropology. That is, what are we to do with ethnographic museums and collections, particularly those whose provenance and source too often lies in deeply violent, appropriating colonial pasts, and whose legitimacy no one can be confident about anymore? And because ethnographic museums are, for anthropologists, a bit like that scandalous unruly uncle who no one quite knows how to handle, and I think we all have one of those, this may also have some implications for the future of social anthropology as a discipline, particularly what I think of as subjunctive anthropology. So that's what the lecture is about. But before I get to museums, let me say a few words about humanness and why now is an important moment for us to reconsider this. And secondly, about what I mean by the excessive potentialities of stuff. Now, you may be wondering, humanness, why this and why now? Haven't we long ago worked out what humans are and what we are not? Maybe. Certainly, when I was first introduced to social anthropology, we were all taught that since the early 20th century, everyone agreed to something sometimes called the psychic unity of mankind or humankind, as one biologically defined species. So here's a quote, that all humans share cognitive and linguistic capacities that are grounded in biology, and that uniformly underlie how we relate to one another and to the world we live in, regardless of differential cultural upbringing. Now, I think most anthropologists, and probably most right-minded person, would still agree in a very general, everyday sense with this basic principle. Right? And hereby, the purpose of anthropology and the social sciences more generally was therefore to understand human social, cultural, political, and historical diversity and variation taking place over or kind of above this basic biological sameness. And it was the broad acceptance of these kinds of principles that fed into what we might call modern humanism as a political force, particularly in the post-World War II context, with the development in 1945 of the United Nations and things like the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, championing the equal value, rights, and worth of all people and all peoples. So then, if all of this was so well accepted and institutionalized, what then is the problem? Why revisit the question of humanness or humanism again, here and now? And I think there are two reasons why this has again become a question, and they are both important. One has to do where anthropological thinking has come to since the mid-20th century, and the second has to do with the extreme right-wing politics of difference and exclusion that seems to have come to the fore once again. So, firstly, the materiality turn. For the last 4.5 decades, since Levi-Strauss at least, anthropology as a discipline has been obsessed with dismantling one foundational aspect of modernist post-Enlightenment thought, which is the distinction between nature and culture. This distinction between people and not people, between culture and nature, and related distinctions such as between humans and animals, humans and the material world, between minds and bodies, imagination and experience, meaning and matter, have all been questioned, critiqued, uprooted and deconstructed by 3 or 4 generations of anthropologists. We are still doing this. Whole careers have been built around this problem. And this foundational distinction between nature and culture has been revealed as very deeply embedded in our universities and institutions, like, for example, the divide between the natural sciences and the social sciences and humanities. And it is this distinction upon which those core modernist ideas about humanness have been built. Now, I can't go into all the critiques that anthropologists have delivered of this distinction. If I did that, I might as well give you an undergraduate degree in anthropology. Suffice to say that what was once considered to be an almost universal aspect of human thought, the separation of nature from culture, has been revealed time and again as a very particular way of understanding the world that derives from modernist post-Enlightenment thought, from thinkers like Descartes, hence Cartesian dichotomy, and philosophers like Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke, who posited a universal human historical transition from a state of nature to a state of culture. As I say, I can't go into this, it would take too long. However, it does suffice to say that this nature-culture distinction never worked cross-culturally, and even in Europe, it doesn't work historically. It's all far more complex than that, and as Latour might say, we have never really been modern. But what I will say, as background to the rest of this lecture, is that my work over the last 20 years has been very much engaged with a very particular aspect of this longer ongoing critique. This is an aspect which has been a dominant force in our discipline for the last 20 years, what I call broadly the materiality turn. This emerged in the early 2000s, partly as a response to the postmodern turn and its tendency to see everything as socially or culturally constructed. as its tendency to see everything as a constant play of representations and meanings detached from the material properties and qualities of stuff, from our bodies, and from the material world of which we are a part. Thereby ignoring the material world as wholly subservient to and separate from the social constitution of everything. And thereby, in its own way, the postmodern turn maintained the very same nature-culture distinction by taking an opposing position from previous forms of natural or biological determinism. The materiality turn emerged, therefore, as a response to the dominance of a kind of postmodern anthropology that reduced everything to the constant contest over meaning and representation. This materiality turn has, over the last 2 decades, been focused on trying to think beyond the distinctions between humans and the material world in a vast array of contexts. From the work of science and technology studies like Bruno Latour, thinking about how agency emerges from networks of people and things, to the work of Tim Ingold, focusing on the active properties of materials and how they afford, shape, and give traction to human thought and action in diverse ways. And to the huge amount of work rethinking human-animal relations and multi-species ethnography. And I would include here the so-called ontological turn that was championed by a particular bunch of young scholars at Cambridge in the mid-2000s, who were influenced by Marilyn Strathern's work on relationality and, amongst others, Viveris de Castro's writings on Amazonian perspectivism, to focus productively, I think, on the distinction between matter and meaning. And also, at the same time, and much more problematically, to make some quite extreme claims about deep-rooted ontological differences between different peoples, seeking to restore, often with a self-gratifying emancipatory zeal, a sense of radical alterity or difference between peoples. Now, some of those early claims about radically different worlds and radically different ontologies have now been subject to a distinct retreat by the very same champions of this ontological turn in recognition of, quote, the preposterous essentializations that such claims make. Although, unfortunately, in some more problematic versions of recent decolonial debates, they seem sometimes to return once again. I will come back to this a little bit later. Now, in my own work, in my engagement with this materiality turn, questions about what stuff does, rather than what it means, has appeared repeatedly. In the work I did on the politics of representing and managing the past at Great Zimbabwe, for example, that is where I began to think about how contestations over meaning, over different pasts, are shaped by the material presence and properties of places from the past. And in the second project, also in South Africa, on the political materialities of land and water in the presence of a late colonial dam, I focused on how contests in the present, over land reform, for example, are shaped by the uneasy presence of past interventions in the forms and substance of landscape, like dams, like contour ridges, and like graves and ruins. And in my more recent work on bones and the politics of the dead, I focused on how the intense politics of commemoration and of dealing with legacies of past violence and death are shaped by the uncertain material qualities of human remains themselves. And in my most recent work, I have taken these ideas about the uncertain but productive qualities of stuff and applied them to the study of African cities, to explore how the material qualities and flows of cities shape their always incomplete and always emergent becoming. Now, all of this work, in the broad sweep of the materiality turn, has sometimes been labelled post-humanist, exactly because it questioned previously dominant ideas about what makes humans distinct from non-humans. But, and here I come to my second point, I have never been comfortable with this post-humanist label. And the reason for this is simple. Humanism, apart from its theoretical underpinnings, so well critiqued now, was also always and remains a profoundly important and laudable political project, to seek the basis of and to reinforce the fundamental equality of all humans, all people. This, I think, is an idea which is under profound attack everywhere these days, it seems. Like this. Or this. Think of the United States' 2 devastating wars of the 2000s in the wake of 9/11, when hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, usually without even being documented. This is what prompted Judith Butler to ask, who counts as human? Whose lives count as lives? What makes for a grievable life? And we can ask, are humans really considered of equal value in the world today? Look at the increasingly xenophobic and brutal anti-immigrationism across the global north and the south, and here in South Africa. What about the thousands of refugees and migrants left to drown in the Mediterranean or the English Channel, or detained and then expelled to distant places without care or sympathy? Or we can look at Gaza, with over 1 million people displaced, their homes destroyed, left starving, 35,000 civilians killed over the last few months in Israel's genocidal act of revenge against Hamas. Or, on a different scale, the millions of precariat in South Africa and across the global south, and increasingly the north, who will never have the security of stable jobs, incomes, pensions, or welfare, while a tiny minority of super rich becomes ever richer and ever smaller. Or, to zoom in on a city where I've done a lot of work recently, unequal Nairobi, where on one side of the city 500,000 people lived in crammed slums, marginalized and excluded from basic services like water and sanitation or flood protection, and are subjected to extrajudicial killings by police, which are justified by dominant languages across other parts of the same city that define them as thugs and criminals. In such, and these are just a few examples, can we say that the project of defending the equality of humans is complete and ready to be abandoned? No, absolutely not. Surely we must defend humanism's attempt, however flawed, however incomplete, to cement and protect the equality of all people. That, to me, seems self-evident. And if the previous theoretical basis of how we understand humanness has been undermined, then surely in these desperate contexts, we need to think again about what it is that people share. We need now, surely, to focus not on rarefying and cementing artificial differences between people, but rather focus on what we have in common. Importantly, I'm not suggesting that we need to deny the very real cultural, political, social, and historical differences and diversities of people and peoples through space and time. Indeed, these diversities are an essential part of humanness, which emerge from what it is that we do share. And that, I think, lies in our encounters and engagements with the uncertain and productive possibilities and potentialities emergent from the excessivities of stuff. So let me turn now to discuss what I mean by this before we finally get to the real substance of this lecture and what it all means for the future of ethnographic museums and subjunctive anthropology. So it was during work on death and human remains that I first began to think about the excessivities of stuff. This was in the context of a long series of discussions about what bones and bodies do, with some excellent colleagues like my good friend John Harries at Edinburgh. We were much influenced by the work of Chris Pinney, who talks about the talk of materiality, the way that stuff and material presence always exceeds and defies semantic closure. In my work on the politics of the dead, I focused on how human materials, but maybe all materials, are problematic subject objects that demand to be held still and fixed into stable forms of meaning. For example, how human remains demand to be identified as human subjects, whether as named people or, more generically, as the dead, or as ancestors, or as victims, specimens, or whatever. And how we have developed hugely specialized sciences and techniques to do this, like forensic science, or indeed divination and spirit possession. And yet, at the same time, even as they demand stabilization and fixing into meaning and identity, in the end, human remains, like all materials and things, always defy any contingent imposition of meaning, closure, or fixing. They defy semantic closure. They defy the regimes of knowledge that we produce to make sense of them because they are excessive to meaning. An important point here is that in a modernist Enlightenment view, there was an assumption that the objective material world out there was in theory knowable, while the world of human creativity, thought, and imagination was perhaps limitless. In what I am proposing, there is no objective world that we are not already a part of. And that world is never still. It is always changing and becoming. It is incomplete. And most of all, that world is not, in the end, knowable. It is excessive to human regimes of knowing and meaning, however sophisticated those become, and however much that world seems to demand fixation and the imposition of meaning and sense-making by us. Materials, in other words, are excessive to human attempts to hold them still, to stabilize them into meaning. They are always uncertain, and this is productive and full of potentiality. As a result, human meaning-making, the attempt to stabilize and fix something or to hold it still, is always incomplete and contingent. Stuff can always become something else, beyond what human knowledge-making tries to determine it to be. It is full of potentiality to be something else, exciting, full of possibility, full of could-bes. And it is this profound uncertainty and excessivity that, in the context of contested commemorations and legacies of violence and death, often drives the intense politics that human remains become entangled in. The key point here is that stuff, material stuff, an object, a thing, our bodies, our very material existence, or, as David Graeber once put it in his reply to Viveris de Castro, reality, is always more than any representation of it, or any way of understanding it. And to explain what I mean, we could use an analogy. Perhaps we can think of a fantastically accurate picture of a landscape. However accurate that picture, however many megapixels that it's taken to produce, say, that picture, or representation, or meaning, or knowledge system, if you will always, by definition, be less than that landscape itself. If that picture was 100% accurate, it would simply be that landscape. And given that a thing never really is, but is always becoming something else, nothing can be held still. There is no meaning or form of knowledge that can encapsulate or hold still everything that a thing, a landscape, the world could be. So what then is it that humans share? How are we to understand humanness? I think the humanness that we share is an orientation towards meaning-making, towards ordering something that we are a part of, but which in the end will always defy and exceed our attempts to fix, hold still, or make sense of. This proposition is, in a sense, both a challenge to the ideas of one of our discipline's most important forebearers, Mary Douglas, and at the same time it draws much from what she proposed. In brief, Mary Douglas, in her famous work on purity and pollution, argued that a thing becomes dirt or rubbish or pollution or whatever by where it is found, by its social context. So the meaning of a thing is not inherent to it, but is always socially constituted. This was a hugely important insight for anthropology, and that's why we still teach Mary Douglas today. But in this view, the material properties of a thing are kind of irrelevant. Everything is socially or culturally constituted. In contrast, in the approach I'm proposing, the material qualities of a thing really matter for how meanings about that thing are shaped, forged, and fixed. And yet, those material qualities and the potentialities they embody for forging new kinds of meaning or value or new kinds of knowledge are always more than any meaning-making or sense-making has or could achieve. There are always more possibilities emergent from material qualities of a thing than ever has been or ever will be, stabilized into any specific meaning, value, form of knowledge about that thing. Material qualities, stuff, are excessive to meaning. They defy semantic closure. And yet, what my suggested approach takes from Mary Douglas is a sense of a human will to order. That what humans share is this necessarily flawed, contingent, incomplete, and insatiable impulse to create, to fix, to hold still, meaning in an uncertain and excessive world, of which we are a part, which both demands but always defies our human meaning-making effort. Perhaps, then, what humans share is akin to a kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder, an inability to accept and live with a world that is profoundly uncertain and excessive to our attempts to order or contain it. This might seem scary to many, but actually it's exciting, it's productive, because nothing needs to be how it is. It could always be something else. Other ways of knowing, being, or relating, other could-bes. And to return to the question of human difference and the huge diversities of human thought and action and ways of knowing, being, and relating with each other and the world, this approach suggests that there is so much to be gained from learning and working across human difference and diversity. In this view, the task of anthropology, and perhaps museums, is to explore what other ways of knowing, being, and relating already exist out there, and what new forms of knowing, being, and relating could yet be achieved from our diverse engagements with the excessive potentialities of our material existence. What I would like to suggest then is that what humans share is this flawed, contingent, but always incomplete, but creative, productive, diverse, and exciting impulse to try to order and make meaning and sense of a world that in the end is always excessive to those very attempts. A world full of could-bes, where alternative, better forms of relating with each other, of inclusion rather than exclusion, in and with the world is always possible. And in this approach, the difference or alterity that matters is not between you and me, or different kinds of human, nor is it differences between humans and animals, or humans and things, or people in the material world, but rather the difference between what is and what could be, what is yet to come. So that's my preamble complete. So let me now actually turn to the lecture. I hope you're still with me. If not, I think there's some booze over there. Okay. Like anthropology, ethnographic museums remain for many people something of a problem. Weighed down with the dubious legacies of their accumulating colonial pasts, and doomed, it seems, to endlessly fix people and things into artificial geographies of difference and exclusion, their futures often seem limited to reacting to and undoing some of the more nefarious effects of their difficult pasts. The problem is at once both conceptual and practical and material, and is often hindered by policies and politics that seem antithetical to each other. This is not to say that ethnographic museums, like all museums, have not been subject to profound transformation. Like anthropology, the last 4 decades have seen tremendous efforts to engage with, respond to, and move beyond some of museums' modernist and colonial conceits. From the new museology of the 1980s, rethinking the role of museums in society in terms of outreach, education, and relevance, to the efforts of the late 1990s to reconstitute them as optimistic multicultural contact zones, sometimes described as second-wave new museology. And on to more recent critiques of museums as contact zones, and of the very possibility of challenging their enduring neo-colonial normativities and asymmetries amid increasingly vocal demands, not simply for increased critical self-awareness and collaborative representation, but for real, material, and substantial redress, repatriation, and reparation. These museological transformations and the introspections they provoked resonate with commensurate movements in social anthropology. The intense angst of the early 1980s about the very possibility of ethnographic representation find echoes in contemporary concerns about the recursive asymmetries of power and voice that all institutions of knowledge inevitably reproduce, and which continue to bedevil both anthropology and ethnographic museums. If we have come to a moment where collecting ethnographic objects and showing them back to the world, for many still a core raison d'etre of museums, is being fundamentally challenged by very legitimate demands for repatriation and reparation, then we are also at a moment where the legitimacy of anthropology, still a dirty word in many contexts, as a system of knowledge production faces diverse kinds of new challenge. These range from, for example, on the one hand, the anti-intellectualism of governmental concerns with impact and policy relevance, and on the other, from the growing impatience of the marginalized and the excluded, whether in the global south or in the margins of the north, or anywhere in between, seeking to decolonize and rebalance the academy's deeply structured hierarchies, asymmetries, and exclusions. It's noticeable that at the ECAS conference in Cologne last year, the African Studies Conference, leading discussions coalesced around questions of what and who scholarship on the African continent is actually for, and were left pregnant with the unspoken possibility that perhaps the time for anthropological scholarship across the continent had almost elapsed. With all this going on, one might be forgiven for suspecting the future of both anthropology and ethnographic museums to be rather limited. If anthropology sometimes looks torn between the mundaneness of self-referential policy speak on the one side and the rarefied realms of abstract philosophy, for example, the ontological turn, on the other, then the future of ethnographic museums might seem limited to an endless effort to redress problematic colonial pasts in ever more inventive ways, all the while maintaining legal responsibilities for collections whose legitimacy no one is quite sure of. In contrast to this rather dim view, however, I propose a more optimistic position, one that draws on the urgencies forcefully highlighted by the reinvigorated decolonial movements of the first quarter of the 21st century, as well as on important conceptual developments over the last 2 decades that have sought to ground postmodern semantic free-for-all in the properties, affordances, and potentialities of materials, while continuing the longer-term project of transcending the Enlightenment's sticky and stubborn dichotomies of thought and action, i.e. the nature-culture distinction. I imagine a future for ethnographic museums that is heavy less with the weight of past legacies demanding resolution than with the promise of future possibilities. Contingent, multimodal, emergent, shaped but not determined by the presence of multiple temporalities and diverse could-bes. In short, a museum orientated as much towards what happens next as towards the troubling remnants of yesterday and today. So, let me explain how I get there. Like the slightly earlier idea of culture houses that was only semi-implemented in some independent African countries in the 80s, Clifford's notion of museums as contact zones, a decade later, was an important step in the ongoing transformation of ethnographic museums. The possibility of promoting museums not simply as spaces of education and the dissemination of already fixed and bounded forms of knowledge, but rather as permeable spaces of transcultural encounter, cross-cultural dialogues, mediation, and new collaboration between museums and source communities, was exciting, even if some argued it was also an inevitable extension of the museum as an instrument of governmentality expressed as multiculturalism. The observation that as contact zones, ethnographic museums inevitably reproduce notions of the other, even if now often through those others performing themselves as the other, and that they therefore inevitably reify regimes of knowing already determined by museum practice and structure, was only made possible through that very experimentation. In this sense, playing with the idea of museums as contact zones sharpened awareness of the inherent problems that museums can face in seeking to enable or allow for diverse ways of knowing, being, and relating. To what extent, in short, can museums challenge the fundamental asymmetries of which they are a part? Or do they inevitably cajole the other into representing themselves as such, and never on their own terms, but always in the end for the purposes of museums themselves? These kinds of critiques of the contact zone approach fed into widening debates over the last decade for the decolonization of museums and indeed universities, and the need to acknowledge and engage with the continuing effects of coloniality and colonial museology. Acute, urgent, impatient, these debates have had real practical effects in relation to older, longer-running concerns, not just about representation in museums, but about the status, ownership, and repatriation of collections acquired in dubious contexts. Dan Hicks' The Brutish Museum may have picked the low-hanging fruit, given how well-documented and dastardly the Benin bronzes were stolen and then retained by European museums. And most repatriation cases are far more complex and ambiguous, both in terms of provenance and in how collections might be returned. And yet that book has certainly reflected a growing clamour of demanding voices that museums are no longer able to ignore. Indeed, with many university museum collections now accepting the principle of repatriation and many investing in new kinds of collaboration with indigenous and source communities, exploring what that might mean in practice, those who are still holding out, like the British Museum, due largely to the right-wing UK government's position, look increasingly outmoded and off-point. Apart from the growing noise around the status and return of collections, decolonization debates have also refocused attention on what museums represent for whom and how they might do collaboration, with previously marginalized histories increasingly taking center stage in diverse contexts. Recent examinations of Cape Town's slave repasts are a good example here, as were the 75-year commemorations of the so-called Windrush generation in the UK in 2023, which heralded a series of interesting collaborative exhibitions and events celebrating Black British life and culture, despite and in the face of continuing exclusions and forced removals by the UK government. Whatever their urgency, however, recent decolonial debates have also been subject to important emerging critique, and some of this revolves around the failure to take on board the insights of previous generations of post-colonial scholars, such as Baba's work on the double effects of colonial mimicry, Spivak's notion of the subaltern, and Chatterjee's focus on questions of authenticity and anti-colonial nationalism's derivative nature. An unfortunate effect of this sometimes appears in the reification of essentialized static notions of difference, especially around problematically fixed notions like the West, the East, Africa, the South. This obsession with static, often geographized, that's a really difficult word, geographized notions, I've stumbled on that every time I practice this, geographized notions of identity and difference is sometimes echoed in academic discourses that seek to reify difference in ever more extreme, absolute, and abstract terms. There is a danger here of reproducing the same self-other distinctions, often in remarkably atemporal terms, that the edifices of colonial knowledge, museology, and social engineering, like segregation and apartheid, were built upon. While the promises of decolonizing knowledge remain immensely important, particularly for museums and universities, self-styled decolonial approaches are not necessarily open to ephemerality, complexity, incompleteness, or the historical coexistence in close proximities of time and space, of changing and multiple subjectivities, diverse ways of knowing, and emergent relationalities. And a really notable exception here is the work, of course, of Francis Namjoy on incompleteness. So what then is next for ethnographic museums? As I've discussed at greater length in a chapter on the possibilities of decolonizing death and the dead in African context that's coming out later this year, the real promise of decolonizing knowledge involves much more than the urgent necessity to open university research, teaching, curricula, and publication, and of course museums, to groups previously excluded from these forums or from due recognition within them. Important as that project clearly remains, particularly in museum contexts. The larger promise of decolonization for museums and anthropology lies rather, I suggest, in the subjunctive possibilities emergent from the uncertain excessivities of stuff, and the multiple, diverse, emergent, historically embedded, and always contingent responses that encounters with problematic stuff provokes for everybody. In other words, the decolonization of knowledge holds the promise of opening scholarly awareness to the many things that knowledge is or could be, what knowing might consist of, in all of its multitude of subjunctive, contingent, and emergent forms and possibilities, including not only those already coexistent and known in the world now, but also those of its many pasts and its many futures. It is a project that I think anthropology has been preoccupied with greater or perhaps lesser success for some time now, and where I think ethnographic museums might find a future less weighed down with the unresolvable legacies of the past and more orientated to what could be, optimistic, productive, inclusive, and open-ended. The argument I'm developing here builds on the insights not just from decolonization debates, but from the materiality turn of the last 2 decades, which, as I've already discussed, has moved on from its rather crude initial concerns with agencies and the properties of objects in networks of people and things, to explore the excessive potentialities and productive uncertainties inherent in material existence in and with the world in a wide diversity of contexts. This has shown how the talk of materiality defies stabilization into rigid static registers of meaning and identity through established regimes of knowing and rule, which in turn appear increasingly not just as normative and exclusionary, but also contingent, constrained, and inadequate to the task of remaking the world in more inclusionary ways. If the talk of material existence demands, but always exceeds stabilization and essentialization into meaning or identity, then engaging with a diversity of so-called other ways of knowing is not just about overcoming previous exclusions, but about exploring new ways of collaborative knowing, relationality, and being in the world that is always changing, ephemeral, and contingent. It is about improving our shared human ability to know and relate in new open-ended and inclusive ways. This is what I think of as subjunctive anthropology and museology, for it is in the uncertain and excessive potentialities of stuff that subjunctive possibilities for other forms of knowing, for relating with each other in and with the world, that is, for decolonizing knowledge, and for exploring the uncertainties of existence as shared human experience, are to be found. The promise here is that being open to other previously excluded or not yet constituted forms of knowing and relating may expand our repertoire for engaging critically with the potentialities inherent in the stuff of stuff. What this means is that we have to rethink what knowing might consist of, for the larger purpose of reconstituting what we think humanness in the world could be. Ethnographic museums are unusually well placed to lead such a project, exploring other subjunctive possibilities emergent from the excessivities of stuff, by opening up not just to previously excluded people and excluded registers of knowledge, but to new collaborative, multimodal ways of sensing, being, and knowing. What this might look like in practical terms involves critical engagements with other repertoires of intellectual work, such as, for example, working with artists, whose material engagements with stuff are rarely limited to the semantic, text-heavy, weighed down with meaning concerns of academic knowledge producers. And we do increasingly find research projects working with artists, not simply for wider dissemination at the end of a project, as funders might prefer, but from a project's conception phase and through a diversity of methodologies working and thinking with materials. Philip de Boek's well-known collaborations with Congolese photographer Sami Balogi are exemplary of these shifts. This is also what lay at the heart of the scholarly artistic collaborations that I co-curated when I was working in Nairobi through the Remains, Waste and Metonymy exhibitions at the National Museum, which in turn shaped an experimental, multimodal, multivocal, co-curated ethnographic portrait of the city called Nairobi Becoming. It is also why ethnographic museums and galleries find increasing overlap in their work, something to be encouraged as long as the artists are involved, not as representatives of some reconstituted other, but as intellectuals trying to make sense of a shared world that cannot be held still or fixed by anybody, but of which we are all a part. A good example that springs to mind is the Tate Modern's recent A World in Common exhibition of African photography, which brought together over 30 African photographers to explore not only the texture of African identity and traditions and counter-histories, but also imagined futures, in order to illustrate how artists are redefining perceptions of the world we inhabit. Apart from exploring new ways of knowing through collaborations with diverse kinds of knowledge producers, there are important implications and opportunities here for the educational role of museums, recalling the preoccupations of the new museology of the 1980s, positioning ethnographic museums not as storehouses of fixed catalogues of human societies, but rather as spaces, moments, and opportunities for reconstituting how we understand shared humanness in and with the world, necessarily breaking down artificial hierarchies of knowers and learners, creators and consumers, offering new ways of understanding the public role of museums in society. Commensurate with these imperatives, urgent questions about collaborations between museums regionally and internationally are likely to be renewed and reinvigorated, even as in local contexts, museums increasingly reach out beyond the constraints of bricks and mortar, recalling Akko's notion of culture houses from the early 1980s. So you'll be pleased to know I've come to my conclusion. In the epilogue to his celebrated critique of Black Reason, appropriately titled There is Only One World, Achille Mbembe notes that the ultimate purpose of critical black and anti-colonial thought has always been the recognition of a shared common humanity, even if the path towards that goal has often involved, first of all, assertions and reclamations of self-defined difference. The transformations that museums and anthropology have undergone over recent decades, and which continue to preoccupy recent decolonization debates, have, to a large part, continued to be orientated around such assertions and reclamations of difference, in defiance of the totalizing normative and often exclusionary modalities of knowing of dominant knowledge regimes. This immediate, but ultimately intermediary project is far from complete. Much remains to be done to redress the fraught colonial legacies of museums, both in terms of what to do with problematic collections and with the exclusionary, hierarchical and partial knowledge regimes they often embody. All this is particularly acute in the context of the expanding climate crisis, deepening economic uncertainties and inequalities, heightened xenophobia, and ever more brutal border regimes, and the growing impatience with the inadequacies of existing regimes of knowing and relating, as witnessed through hashtag movements like Rhodes Must Fall, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too. All these factors also indicate, however, that the time is ripe to begin to move beyond previous heavy with the past notions of museums towards new, collaborative, open-ended ways of exploring what could be, what I have framed as subjunctive anthropology and museology, and towards the ultimate goal of recognizing and building upon our shared humanity within our one world. That is, a subjunctive one-world museology orientated as much towards what happens next as towards confronting the troubling remnants of yesterday and today. There are signs that such an approach is beginning to gain broader traction. It is noticeable, for example, that the recent exhibition at the Tate Modern, that I mentioned above, A World in Common, focused not only on how different pasts, traditions, and identities could offer counter-histories to once dominant narratives and categories of difference and exclusion, but also new, diverse, imagined futures. Indeed, its explicit purpose, pronounced in its opening statements, and citing Achille Mbembe himself, was, quote, to invite us to imagine a world in common, and that to do this, we must think the world from Africa, to create a more expansive and inclusive narrative of humanity. To conceive of a world in common, visitors were told, is to imagine a future of possibility. Herein, I think, lies the future of ethnographic museums and maybe anthropology. Contingent, multimodal, always becoming, shaped by multiple voices from diverse geographies and temporalities, offering diverse but always emergent and collaborative ways of knowing and relating with each other within the one world that we share. Museums that are alive with possibilities and many could-bes, charged with potentialities drawn from critical engagement with the multiple emergent entanglements of people and things that constitute our one, fragile and divided world. Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening, my name is Fraser McNeill. I am an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pretoria. And I would like to start by thanking Professor Fontein for inviting me here tonight to give some comments. I think anybody in this room could respond at length to what has been a very broad-based presentation, but I have been limited to 7 minutes specifically. No more, no less, and I shall try and keep to my 7 minutes. But I want to use at least half of one of these minutes just to emphasize, as we have just seen, the extent of Professor Fontein's intellectual abilities. He is a fiercely, fiercely independent thinker and broadly interdisciplinary. But on top of that, and I think more generously, he's very kind with his knowledge, and I've personally been a recipient of that, and it's a privilege and an honor to call him a friend and a colleague as well. So, my response to this is rather ambitiously titled, A Possible Installation at a Subjunctive Museum of the Future. And I want to take us back to Mary Douglas, who was mentioned several times in Professor Fontein's inaugural lecture. And there was an emphasis on Mary Douglas's idea that there's an innate human will to order, which I always find quite interesting. And I think I might even disagree with it to some extent, but it's an interesting tool to think with. And as an anthropologist, I want to tell you a story, because that's what we're good at. Several years ago, in our department in anthropology at the University of Pretoria, we unfortunately lost our secretary. And we got a new secretary, Sana Sicelli. And Sana came in, and she wanted to make serious changes to this place. She said the place was old, it was dusty, it was messy. She had to repaint it. The whole place was cluttered. It was excessively cluttered. And she wanted to take things out, throw them out. Now, I am a hoarder. It takes a lot for me to throw anything away. I need to be convinced, and even sometimes I'll hide it somewhere in the bins where I can go and get it again, right? So, Sana said we have to clean out the old storeroom in the anthropology department of the University of Pretoria. And I have never been more present in the office every day than I was when Sana was going through the old storeroom in the office, because I wanted to make sure that everything she was throwing out had my approval. At the very, very, very back of the office, underneath hundreds of old course guides and exam scripts, and we found these boxes. And without looking at them, Sana picked them up. They're going out. I said, wait a minute, let's have a look and see what's in these boxes. And I found something really interesting in these boxes. It was a collection of slides that were used by old Volkerkunde anthropologists in the days before we had PowerPoint. But interestingly, there was absolutely no notes associated with this. It was slides. Now, the old Volkerkunde anthropologists, for those who don't know, were a fascinating bunch with a really dodgy past, because they gave a strong intellectual backbone to the apartheid project. And that happened at the University of Pretoria. And here I was standing over this collection of slides, which was clearly used in the intellectual justification of the apartheid project. But it had been deemed as rubbish. So Mary Douglas would look at that, right? And she would say, well, where is it? It's rubbish, it's pollution because of where it is. But as Professor Fontein was trying to point out, the materiality of these things make them a lot more meaningful. And the two are not mutually exclusive, right? So we can use, but they were thrown away, they were about to be thrown away until I got my claws on them. But they're deeply, deeply meaningful. And there was no notes attached to them, which I found even more intriguing. So, Volkerkunde anthropologists obviously also had this human will to order, because when I started going through these slides, they were obviously in different sections according to tribe. And I remember thinking at the time, this is exactly what the ontological turn is all about. The ontological turn clearly would support this. This is extreme difference, almost ontologically rooted difference. But more than that, it was pictures of different teeth from different groups of people. And even more interesting and upsetting for me, different pictures of women giving birth from the business end. Now imagine the anthropologist there with a camera taking a picture of a woman giving birth. And there were different examples of this from different tribes. I wonder if that woman's name was ever mentioned in the lectures. I doubt it very much. So, as Joost suggested to us, to quote directly, "Nothing needs to be as it is. It can always be something else." And I found myself in a position wondering what I was going to do with this collection of ethnographic stuff, which has got all sorts of potential meanings attached to it. And as I was reading Professor Fontein's lecture, I thought this could be an interesting potential installation at a subjunctive museum of the future. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to make a presentation, and I'm going to call it Capturing Difference. And because there's no notes there, I'm going to allow the students to create the commentary. And I wonder how they will receive it. As Professor Fontein pointed out, there is a rise in ethno-nationalisms at the moment. I have been teaching ethnicity to engineering students. A friend of mine, Dr. Peterson, runs a course, and I've been drawn in to teach ethnicity to engineering students. They fight fiercely with me when I try to explain that ethnicity can be socially constructed, because it's a natural thing. They know it. How dare a white man from Scotland say that there is a sense of political construction in what you think is natural? So I think they would have a mixture of horror at these images, but also a sense of agreement in the difference that was being constructed. So, from this heavy past, can we possibly find a promise of future possibilities? It will be really interesting for me to hear how the students create the narrative on top of this, in the absence of any notes. And with my slides, can I reopen these pictures to some kind of contemporary imagination, some sense of a museum of the future? Might this be one way of moving beyond decolonization, which, as Professor Fontein completely rightly pointed out, must move beyond the idea of transformation of the professorate, which is indeed important, but it must also move beyond the idea of changing the syllabus, which is indeed important. It must be about changing the way that we create knowledge. And that's the tricky part. And your museums of the future will have to be a part of some kind of knowledge creation if they're going to be successful. So, this is my attempt at trying to, in 7 minutes, at trying to provoke you into inviting me again to give this presentation on capturing difference, because I think it will be fascinating. And I don't think it should be limited to one university, but this is about excessive stuff. It's about multiple layers of meaning, and most importantly, it's about the contested nature of knowledge. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just stand in the middle there and we'll get the stuff. Yeah, in closing then, I'm going to be brief. Professor Fontein, it was a very, very interesting lecture. I really enjoyed it. Being a lawyer, law and order is a little bit of a confusing subject that can be changed. but thanks a lot. It was very, very intellectually stimulating. That brings us event to the close. You can please join us for drinks in the room next door. Thank you.